Next, let's take a look at fallback equals true. Now, fallback equals true is an extremely important and very useful feature if you have a lot of static pages. If when your fallback is true, what essentially happens is the first user that tries to access a route that doesn't exist in get static paths. So for example, let's say route 300 that does not exist in get static paths, and fallback is actually true here. What Next.js is going to do is Next.js is going to go ahead and show a state to the user. We have an option to do that, and go and download that page on the go. That page is not pre-rendered. It is essentially downloaded on the fly. So the first user that comes to the site that does discover that page for the first time is going to see that loading state. But the next user comes in, since that page is already pre-downloaded and stored in CDN, right? It is already cached. So the second user onwards, for that page, it is automatically going to return the cached pages. So imagine if you have a very large number of static pages. This is a very useful feature for that. But let's take a look at it one by one, because this specific feature can seem very confusing. So first, let's go ahead and change this to true and see it in action. Now, heading back to the browser, let's go ahead and refresh the page. Now, you can see that there is an error here, a server error that says cannot read property address of undefined. Now, let's take a step back and walk through it one by one. If we set fallback equals true, and this is our data, for example, if that specific route does exist in get static paths, for example, route 0, right? Then it's easy. That page is already pre-rendered. It's already in get static paths, so Next.js is aware about it. So it's just going to render the page. And for simplicity's sake, we are only going to render name and the name of the thing and name of the coffee shop from data. Now, let's say the route does not exist in get static paths. For example, route 300. Then it tries to access the page directly as if the page was already there. So why does it try to do that? So essentially what happens is for route 300, the reason why we get this error and it says tries to access address of undefined, it's because it's essentially going and calling get static props. Because fallback is true, so it's like, all right, I'm gonna go. I am told to go and download this data. Now to download and render this content, it is going to go to get static props. Now in static props, params has an ID of 300. So in coffee stores data.find, it is going to see if this coffee store ID actually matches the params ID or not. Now, in coffee stores.data, we only have ID 0 and ID 1. We don't have ID 300 at all. So find by default is going to return a undefined. Because for find, if it does not find a value, for example, it is going to return undefined if it can find the value in the array. In this case, since 300 does not exist as an ID, it has returned undefined. So it doesn't know that. It has just essentially gone ahead and tried to access values. And the first value that it tries to access that doesn't exist is address. And that's why we get this undefined value. So let's fix it and add 300 route to JSON as dummy data just to see what happens now. Alright, now let's go to coffeestores.json and let's add an ID 300. Now let's just copy this exact same object and let's say 300. Now, let's call this route 300 to differentiate. And we can keep rest of the information same except the neighborhood again. Route 300 neighborhood. Now, let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you still see that error. Server error, cannot read address undefined. And the reason why we're still getting this error, and even though it has gone ahead and added this data, so get static props actually passes. So if we print out, we already have console logged props right here. So if we take a look at it in the browser, coffee store actually does exist. So for example, if we inspect and open up the developer tools, and let's close it and let's refresh it again. Now, we still get this error even though 300 route does exist in JSON now. So let's see what's happening. Now, this value does exist in JSON. So in get static props now, it is able to find it, and now coffee store prop does have a value. But it still doesn't work. And that's because route does not exist in the get static paths. So because of that, what happens is it immediately goes and accesses the value and it does not exist. It needs a second to essentially wait, download that data, cache it, and then return this for it to work. So in order to do that, we can use a property from the router which allows us to show a loading state in the meanwhile. And that's exactly what the docs recommend as well, that Next.js will serve a fallback version of the page on the first request. So this is that fallback version, and it injects into the router a fallback value. So we can say if router dot is fallback is true, then return a loading state. Let's save it and run it in the browser. And you can see that loading state was instant. Let me refresh again. And you can see loading and then data now. It says page 300. Whatever we have learned so far, let's wrap it up by looking at a diagram. Now, with fallback equals true and with this specific data, this is what happens. We check, does the route exist in get static paths? In case of route 0, it does. So it's just going to render the name Strangelove Coffee, right? Which is the 0th route. But in case of route 300, it doesn't exist in data and it tries to access the page. So it gets an error. Now, with router is fallback true, it essentially checks again, hey, does route exist in get static paths? For route 0, that's true, so yes, it renders it. But in the case of route 300, it doesn't. So with router is fallback, it's going to return a loading state. Now, once we add ID 300 in the data itself, now we return the name route 300 because now it exists. But let's say that ID 300 is not in data at all. Then we are going to get an error again that says failed to load static props. Alright, I hope this gives you a good understanding of fallback true. And I hope you're having as much fun as I am having teaching you. So I'll see you in the next one where we will explore more fun things about Next.js together.